In a world where emperors vanished, only one institution remained. For centuries, the Roman Empire was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, from the fog of Britain to the deserts of Syria, from the coast of North Africa to the forests of the Rhine. It was a machine of military and bureaucratic perfection. But in the 4th and 5th centuries, the machine broke. The emperors grew weaker. The frontiers collapsed. The legions stopped being paid. And Rome, the eternal city, the center of the known world, was no longer the center of power. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire was gone. No emperor, no army, no tax system, no functioning imperial administration in Italy. But one structure did not disappear in the ashes of the empire: the Church of Rome, and at its head, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. To understand how the Papal States became a medieval superpower, we have to look at the political reality of the collapse. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the Bishop of Rome held immense spiritual authority, but he held absolutely zero state power. He was a religious leader operating inside a hostile, pagan empire. But then came Constantine. In the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine the Great legalized Christianity. He didn't just tolerate the bishops, he funded them. He granted property. He built massive basilicas. For the first time, the Bishop of Rome was experiencing the flow of imperial patronage. Land grants began. The church accumulated massive, wealthy estates, but we must make a critical distinction here. The Pope was not a ruler. He owned land. He administered property. He was a very wealthy landlord, but he was not sovereign. The Roman emperor still ruled the world. Then the West fell. Italy became a bloody, chaotic battlefield. Ostrogoths, Byzantines, Lombards. The capital of Italy was moved to the swamp fortress of Ravenna. The actual Roman emperor was sitting thousands of miles away in the east, in Constantinople. And in this chaos, a power vacuum opened up in Rome. And something unexpected happened. The Bishop of Rome began doing things that emperors used to do: negotiating with barbarian invaders, organizing the food supply so the citizens wouldn't starve, managing the urban defense of the city walls, acting as a political mediator. He didn't do this because he wanted to be a king. He did it because there was literally no one else left to do it. The imperial tax structure had vanished. The old, wealthy senatorial elite had faded into obscurity. Military protection from the east was completely unreliable. The church stepped in. It owned land. It had wealth. It had an administrative network that stretched across regions. And most importantly, it had legitimacy. The people trusted the church more than they trusted the warlords burning their farms. By the mid-8th century, this gradual accumulation of land and crisis management would crystallize into something entirely new: a territorial state governed by the Pope. Not just a bishop, not just a religious figure, a temporal sovereign, the Papal States. They would stretch across central Italy, slicing the peninsula in half. They would last in various forms for more than 1,000 years, right up until their annexation in the 19th century. And today, they survive in miniature as the smallest country on Earth, Vatican City. But that political power did not appear overnight. It was not created by theology. It was created by a vacuum. Under Constantine, the church gained property, but property is not sovereignty. True sovereignty would not come from the Romans. It would come from the north, from a new breed of warlord. In 756, a Frankish king named Pepin the Short would grant territory to Pope Stephen II, not as church property, but as political dominion. That moment would transform the papacy from a spiritual authority into a state. But before Pepin, before the Franks, before the formal birth of the Papal States, we need to understand how Rome survived the darkest years of the Middle Ages when the empire did not. The donation of Pepin didn't create the Pope's power out of thin air. It legalized something that had been forming in the shadows for centuries: the Bishop of Rome becoming the only authority in central Italy that could still act like a government. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the papacy inherited a ghost world. Titles still existed, laws still existed, traditions still existed. But the machinery that made them real was fading. Rome was no longer protected by legions that answered instantly to an emperor. It was protected by distance, by negotiation, and by whatever resources could be scraped together locally. And this is the first key point. Before the Papal States existed as a sovereign nation, the papacy already held massive assets: land, estates, storehouses, donations, church property that functioned like a shadow treasury across Italy. But it was a fragile kind of power because it was not sovereignty. These lands were held under the shifting authority of whoever claimed Italy at the time. A king could recognize them or seize them. An emperor could confirm them or revoke them. And when the early medieval world turns violent, property without a sword is just an invitation for a robbery. By the mid-6th century, Italy became a meat grinder. The Ostrogoths held the peninsula until the Byzantine Emperor Justinian tried to violently pull Italy back into the Eastern Empire. His reconquest was massive, expensive, and devastating. And even when the Byzantines finally reclaimed Rome, they didn't restore the old stability. They replaced it with a thinner kind of control, administered from Ravenna, defended too slowly, and funded by an empire that had endless other priorities in the east. Then, in 568, the Lombards crossed the Alps, and the map changed shape forever. They established themselves in the north, strong enough to hold territory, close enough to threaten Rome, and positioned in a way that made the papacy feel completely trapped. Not trapped by walls, trapped by geography, because from this point forward, central Italy becomes a corridor under crushing pressure. Lombard power pressing down from the north, Byzantine authority trying to hold on from the east and south, and Rome sitting right in the middle exposed. The papacy's only real escape route was the sea. And here's the brutal political reality. Rome might have been formally Byzantine, but Constantinople was simply too far away to be a reliable shield. By the 8th century, the Byzantine grip weakened even further. The empire had bigger fires to put out with the rise of the Islamic caliphates in the east, and the Lombards knew it. The Lombards didn't need to conquer the whole peninsula overnight. They just needed to tighten the noose around Rome, take cities, pressure supply routes, isolate Byzantine allies, force the Pope into a choice. Because the Pope had influence, but influence is not an army, he could rally public opinion, he could negotiate. He could leverage the terrifying religious authority of excommunication. But he could not stop a kingdom of heavy cavalry from marching, unless he found someone who could. And that is the exact moment the Papal States become possible. Not because the Pope suddenly wanted to be a landlord, but because the papacy was discovering the hardest truth of the early medieval world. If you want to survive between hungry kingdoms, you don't just need sanctity. You need a protector, or you need to become a sovereign power in your own right. So when the Lombard threat grows and Byzantine protection shrinks to nothing, Pope Stephen II looks north, past the Alps, toward the one rising force in Europe that has both religious legitimacy and raw military muscle, the Franks. And when Pope Stephen reaches out, he isn't asking for charity. He's negotiating the birth of a new political order, one where the church doesn't merely advise rulers, it becomes one. If the last century was about pressure, this era was about transaction, because what happened in 754 and 756 was not charity, it was cold, calculated strategy. By the mid-8th century, the Lombards had tightened their grip on Italy. They had seized Ravenna, they were at the gates of Rome, and the Byzantine Empire, once the theoretical shield of the peninsula, was completely paralyzed, unable to send a single soldier to help. So Pope Stephen II did something unprecedented. He crossed the Alps. A Roman pontiff leaving Italy and traveling north to seek military protection was not just symbolic diplomacy. It was a blaring declaration that the political center of gravity in Europe was shifting forever. Away from the ancient emperors of Constantinople and toward the barbarian kings of the north. The man he sought out was Pepin, king of the Franks. Pepin was not an emperor, he was not a Roman. He was a recently crowned king whose own legitimacy was highly questionable. Just a few years earlier, Pepin had deposed the last of the old Frankish kings and taken the throne for himself. But he didn't do it alone. He did it with the Pope's blessing, and that matters. Because now the relationship was reciprocal. The Pope had legitimized Pepin's kingship. Now, Pepin was going to legitimize the Pope's sovereignty. In 754, Pepin marched south with a Frankish army. He crossed the Alps into Italy and smashed into the Lombards. They were defeated, they were pushed back. Rome was secured, but the campaign did not end there. In 756, Pepin returned to finish the job. This second intervention was decisive. The Lombards were forced to surrender the massive swathes of territory they had stripped from the Byzantines, most importantly, the Exarchate of Ravenna. And here is the turning point of the Middle Ages. Pepin did not return those lands to the Byzantine emperor. He gave them to the Pope. This act became known as the Donation of Pepin, not a donation in the modern philanthropic sense, but a legal transfer of sovereignty. The Exarchate of Ravenna was not just empty farmland. It was a former imperial administrative core, a highly structured territory with cities, tax revenue, and strategic depth. By handing it to the papacy, Pepin transformed the Pope from a landholder sitting under someone else's empire into a temporal ruler. The Bishop of Rome was no longer merely a spiritual authority. He was now a prince. For Pepin, the calculation was elegant. He gained a loyal, heavily fortified buffer state in central Italy, a papal domain completely dependent on Frankish protection. He crippled Lombard influence. He permanently undercut Byzantine claims in the West, and he secured his own dynasty by tying the Frankish crown directly to the word of God. The papacy gained land. Pepin gained divine political endorsement. This was not subservience. This was symbiosis. The donation of 756 effectively created the territorial core of the Papal States. A solid band of land stretching across central Italy, from Rome to Ravenna, forming a political corridor that no longer answered to Constantinople. For the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a new kind of power had emerged in Italy. Not imperial, not tribal, not dynastic, ecclesiastical, but territorial. And that combination would change medieval politics permanently. Because from this moment forward, any king seeking legitimacy in Western Europe would have to consider one terrifying fact. The Pope now ruled land, and land means revenue. Revenue means independence. Independence means leverage. The donation of Pepin did not just protect Rome, it reshaped the map of the world. If Pepin created the Papal States, Charlemagne weaponized them. When Pepin died in 768, his kingdom passed into the hands of his son, a ruler whose name would eclipse nearly every monarch of his age, Charlemagne. Under his rule, the alliance between the Frankish crown and the papacy matured from a desperate emergency cooperation into a highly structured geopolitical design. The relationship was no longer reactive. It became architectural. Charlemagne understood something fundamental about medieval power. Control of Italy meant influence over Rome, and influence over Rome meant influence over legitimacy itself. For the papacy, the Frankish connection meant absolute protection. The Lombards were finally destroyed. For Charlemagne, the papacy meant divine authorization, and that exchange reshaped the map of Europe. Charlemagne did not merely repeat his father's donation. He expanded and formalized it. Under his reign, the territories acknowledged as belonging to the papacy exploded in size. It included Rome itself, the former Exarchate of Ravenna, the Duchy of the Pentapolis, parts of Lombardy and Tuscany, the island of Corsica, even elements of the southern Duchy of Benevento. This was no longer a narrow, defensive corridor of survival. This was a massive, central Italian bloc, a papal-controlled zone stretching across the entire peninsula, effectively cutting Italy in half and separating northern political powers from the south. Whether the Pope practically governed all these claimed lands with sheriffs and tax collectors is a different question. But politically, the framework was clear. The papacy now ruled territory recognized by the most powerful monarch in Western Europe, and that recognition mattered because recognition creates permanence. It was a system of brilliant strategic mutual benefit. For Charlemagne, Italy was stabilized, Lombard resistance vanished, Byzantine influence was pushed into the sea. The Frankish realm extended its shadow southward without the cost of a direct military occupation. For the papacy, borders hardened. Revenues increased exponentially. Political independence deepened. This was not submission, it was strategic interdependence. And then came the moment that defined the relationship. The moment that defined the next 1,000 years of history. Christmas Day in the year 800. Inside St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head. He declared him Emperor of the Romans. This act was not ceremonial theater. It was a geopolitical earthquake. The Western Roman imperial title, dormant, dead, and buried since 476, was being revived. But it was not being revived by Constantinople. It was being revived by Rome, and not through Byzantine bloodlines, through papal authority. The symbolism was revolutionary and deeply dangerous. The Pope had crowned an emperor, which implied a terrifying new political doctrine. If the Pope could crown an emperor, he could define emperorship. From this point forward, Western Europe would operate under a new reality. Imperial authority in the West was inseparable from papal sanction. The Holy Roman Empire was born, and with it, 1,000 years of tension, war, and power sharing between the throne and the altar. By 800, the Papal States were no longer just a defensive buffer created by Pepin's donation. They were a recognized territorial sovereignty embedded inside a massive imperial framework. The Pope ruled land, the Emperor ruled realms, but each required the other. That balance, fragile, ambitious, and unstable, would define medieval politics for centuries, because the papacy was no longer merely a spiritual guide. It was a geopolitical player, and geopolitics never remains peaceful for long. The alliance between the throne and the altar had created an empire, but empires fracture, and when they fracture, power becomes negotiable. After the coronation of Charlemagne in 800, the papacy stood at the absolute center of Western political legitimacy. It had crowned an emperor, it had secured its land. But when Charlemagne died, the massive structure he built did not endure. His grandsons tore the empire apart, and with division came distance. The papacy's privileged, direct connection to a unified Frankish military dissolved. The political gravity that had once centered on a single, powerful emperor splintered into competing, weaker kingdoms. Italy fell into instability. Imperial power in the peninsula evaporated. Frankish oversight receded, and Rome was left completely exposed. As imperial cohesion collapsed in the 9th century, so did papal security. Without a dominant Western emperor stationed nearby to enforce the borders, the Papal States became vulnerable. But the threat didn't come from invading barbarians this time. It came from inside the house. It came from the Roman aristocratic factions. The papacy was still spiritually supreme, but politically it was fragile. And in the 10th century, that fragility turned into outright exploitation. A powerful, ruthless Roman noble family, the Theophylacti, rose to dominate the city. They did not abolish the papacy. They captured it. Through patronage, coercion, bribery, and dynastic manipulation, they placed compliant puppet popes on the throne of St. Peter. This period would later be described by church historians as the Dark Age of the papacy. The Saeculum Obscurum, or more bluntly, the rule of harlots. But beneath the scandalous language lies a cold political reality. The Papal States had become a prize for local mobsters. Popes functioned less as sovereign rulers and more as figureheads, while local noble houses carved up influence across Roman territories. The papacy had territory, but it had lost its autonomy. Then from the north, a new power moved south. In the mid-10th century, the German king, Otto I, expanded his massive military authority into Italy. Like Charlemagne before him, Otto understood the intoxicating symbolism of Rome. And Pope John XII understood something equally important. If the papacy did not secure an imperial bodyguard, it would remain a hostage to Roman elites forever. In 962, Otto was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. The imperial title was renewed, not by inheritance but by papal coronation, and with it came a new, ironclad political arrangement, the Diploma Otnianum. This treaty formalized the relationship between the German emperor and the Papal States. It declared that the emperor would act as the ultimate guarantor of papal independence. No Roman noble family could ever dominate the Papal States again. But there was a catch. The papacy had to acknowledge imperial oversight in its own administration. The emperor became the protector. The pope became the legitimizer. The Carolingian alliance of the past had been about expansion and reward. The new Ottonian alliance was about stabilization and strict supervision. From this point forward, the relationship between the Papal States and the Holy Roman Empire would violently oscillate between cooperation and confrontation, because the fundamental question of European politics had changed. It was no longer who protects Rome. It became who controls Rome. By the late 10th century, the papacy had survived internal corruption. Imperial authority had returned to Italy. The Papal States were no longer a playground for Roman nobles, but imperial oversight was now deeply embedded in their political DNA. The papacy had gained security at the absolute cost of its autonomy. This tension, the emperor as a protector versus the emperor as a superior, would define centuries of medieval warfare. The struggle between the crown and the mitre had officially begun, and it would not remain quiet for long. All alliances are temporary, even sacred ones. The partnership forged between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor had restored order in the 10th century. But over the next 300 years, that exact same relationship would become a battlefield, not always with swords, but with authority. After Otto I, German rulers increasingly viewed Italy not as a distant sphere of influence, but as an extension of their own imperial sovereignty. Northern Italian cities became battlegrounds of imperial assertion, and Rome was no exception. Emperors claimed the absolute right to approve papal elections, to intervene in Roman politics, to enforce imperial law across Italian territories. But the papacy was evolving. It was no longer content with being a protected vassal. It sought supremacy. The reform movements of the 11th century, driven by ruthless figures like Pope Gregory VII, transformed the papal office into something far more militant. The Pope was no longer merely the Bishop of Rome. He was the vicar of Christ, and no emperor outranked Christ. This ideological collision ignited what we now call the Investiture controversy, a struggle over who had the authority to appoint bishops, the emperor or the Pope. This was not an argument about church ceremony. It was about control of wealth, land, and military loyalty. Bishops in the Middle Ages were not just spiritual leaders. They were territorial lords. Whoever appointed them controlled entire regions of the map. When Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII collided over this question, all of Europe watched. Excommunication, rebellion, the legendary image of an emperor standing barefoot in the snow at Canossa, begging the Pope for forgiveness, became the ultimate symbol of medieval political theater. But the struggle did not end in the snow. It institutionalized a bitter hostility between imperial authority and papal ambition. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Italy was a fractured chessboard divided between two massive factions. The Guelphs, supporters of the papacy, and the Ghibelline supporters of the empire. Cities split, noble families split, entire regions went to war. The Papal States were no longer passive beneficiaries of imperial protection. They were active, violent participants in shaping the balance of power. Then came the Hohenstaufen dynasty, powerful, assertive, dangerously ambitious. Frederick II, the most formidable of these German emperors, posed an existential threat to papal autonomy. He controlled the massive kingdom of Sicily to the south, and he claimed imperial authority in the north. The Papal States sat right between the two blades of the scissors. If Frederick consolidated his control, the papacy would be entirely encircled, suffocated. The conflict between Frederick II and successive popes defined the 13th century. Excommunications were fired like weapons. Alliances were forged. Military campaigns were launched. The struggle was not merely territorial, it was ideological. Who ruled Christendom, the emperor or the pope? When Frederick II died in 1250, the dynasty's grip slipped. By 1254, the Hohenstaufen position in Italy collapsed definitively. Their bloodline fractured. Their massive ambitions failed. And with their fall, something remarkable happened. German imperial intervention in central Italy diminished almost overnight. Without a sustained German military presence pressing southward, the Papal States began consolidating internally. They strengthened their fiscal systems. They appointed regional governors. They built up their own military capacities and vast diplomatic networks. French and German influence waned. Roman aristocratic dominance no longer dictated outcomes. The papacy was not merely surviving anymore. It was governing. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Papal States functioned as a largely independent political entity, not fully immune from foreign pressure, but no longer subordinate to it. The long arc of history, from Constantine's early patronage to Pepin's desperate donation, to centuries of brutal imperial rivalry, had culminated in something entirely new. A sovereign papal principality. In a world where emperors once dictated Rome's fate, the papacy had reversed the equation. It now negotiated from a position of absolute strength. The road to independence had not been linear. It had been violent, political, calculated, and incredibly patient. The Papal States were no longer a byproduct of imperial generosity. They were a medieval superpower in their own right, and all of Europe would have to reckon with that. Power in medieval Europe wore many crowns, but none claimed heaven itself. By the High Middle Ages, the Bishop of Rome was no longer merely a spiritual guide. He was a sovereign ruler, a diplomat, a financier, a war maker, and at times the ultimate arbiter of kings. The Papal States' greatest weapon was not its army, it was its legitimacy. To medieval Europe, the Pope was not simply another monarch. He was the earthly representative of divine authority. When the papacy spoke, kings listened, emperors negotiated, nobles hesitated. Excommunication could unmake a ruler overnight. An interdict could paralyze the religious life of an entire kingdom. The Papal States transformed spiritual capital into raw political leverage. That leverage launched massive crusades to the Holy Land. It brokered international treaties. It funded continent-spanning wars. And it settled disputes across the entirety of Christendom. But the Papal States were not only influential, they were staggeringly wealthy. Control of central Italian territories meant total control of agricultural revenue, pilgrimage income, ecclesiastical taxation, and strategic dominance over the busiest trade corridors in the Mediterranean. Rome became a global financial node. The Curia developed into a highly sophisticated bureaucratic machine. Legal scholars refined canon law. Papal courts adjudicated cases from London to Warsaw. This was governance at scale, not improvised rule, institutional rule. In fact, Italy's chaotic political fragmentation in the centuries that followed cannot be understood without the Papal States. Their physical, territorial presence in the center of the peninsula acted as a permanent wedge. It prevented full northern domination. It blocked southern consolidation. It shaped the balance of power between communes, princes, and emperors. Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, all of them operated in a peninsula where Rome was never neutral, it was a player. The Papal States injected capital, patronage, and power into Italian society. They funded monumental churches, commissioned legendary art, sponsored scholars. Without that concentrated authority holding the center, the trajectory of Italy, both politically and culturally, would have been radically different. Although the Papal States would endure in some form until the 19th century, their true apogee was medieval. This was the era when popes crowned emperors, dictated terms to monarchs, challenged imperial authority, and commanded vast multinational alliances. The transformation from a vulnerable bishopric into a territorial superpower had taken centuries, from Constantine's early patronage, to Pepin's desperate donation, to brutal imperial rivalries, to negotiated, heavily armed independence. Each stage of survival reinforced the next. The Papal States represent one of the most unusual political experiments in human history. A religious office evolving into a sovereign territorial nation, not through conquest alone, but through fierce opportunism, masterful diplomacy, unshakable institutional continuity, and strategic alliances. When empires collapsed, the Church remained. When dynasties fractured and burned, the papacy endured, and that endurance became power. In a world where emperors vanished, only one institution remained. The Papal States were not inevitable. They were constructed, piece by piece, crisis by crisis, alliance by alliance. And from a single donation in 756, emerged a state that would shape the political architecture of Europe for over a millennium. European history without the Papal States would not simply be different. It would be unrecognizable.